Good evening, and welcome to another edition of the Chaplain Abel Show. I apologize for the late start. Ran into some technical difficulties. It looks like they seem to have been squared away. As you know, today was what they call Palm Sunday, and it's also the first day of spring. I know some of you may be wondering, well, Palm Sunday and the first day of spring. I'm just looking at what we read in the paper. Those that are Catholic, it's an important day. As far as Palm Sunday, this is when Jesus rode into the town on a donkey, and people laid down their coats, and in a lot of places where people did not have the money, they cut these little palm trees and laid it on the path that he walked. And so that's why it's considered Palm Sunday. Many people have always wondered why it was called Palm Sunday, and that is what they believe is the reason for it. Well, we all know that next week is Easter, and my message this evening is entitled God's Wonderful Game Plan, the Resurrection of Jesus. I know that won't happen until next week, but I want to get a little jump on it because Easter Sunday is when we actually tell the story of the death, burial, and resurrection. But I want to do it a week early. I have another topic for next week because there are some misconceptions, and I felt that this Sunday would be a good day to cover it, so people will have a more open mind. And before, by way of starting, I'm going to give you a little illustration. Has to do with high school football, but we'll be back in just a minute.
Time God's let you down. Trust in God, though you are tempted sore. Trust in God in your raging war. Trust in God when your life has come apart. Keep on believing. Safely trust
and that was trust in God. Well, by way of illustration, what would you do if you were a high school football player whose coach sent in a play which called for you to run the ball to your opponent's end zone and score for the other team? It has happened. With 7 seconds left in the game, Tishomingo High School was leading Faulkner High School 16-14. At stake was a berth in Mississippi's 1988 State Class 1A playoffs. Tishomingo had the ball on the Faulkner's 40-yard line. All they had to do was run out the clock on the next play, and they would win the game by 2 points. Coach David Herbert, who has Lou Gehrig's disease, and coaches from a seat in the back of a pickup truck, sent in a play to his son and the team's quarterback, Dave Herbert. The play called for a handoff to tailback Shane Hill and for him to run as fast as he could for the other team's end zone and score. "Your daddy must be crazy," protested one of the tackles. So while the argument went on in the team's huddle, a delay of game penalty was called on Tishomingo. Finally, the team lined up the ball, was handed off to the tailback, and he ran 55 yards in the wrong direction. He lay down in the opponent's end zone and waited for the clock to expire, with practically everyone on the field and in the stadium bewildered. The results were 2-point safety for Faulkner. Score tied. Time expired. Was the coach crazy? Was he out of his mind for calling such a play? You see, in order for his team to reach the playoffs, Tishomingo had to beat Faulkner by 4 or more points. After thinking about the chance of going 40 yards on one play or kicking a field goal from that distance, he decided overtime was his best bet. What was the result of the coach's play? Tishomingo won in overtime 22-16 on a third down 2-yard run by Shane Hill. Hill finished the game with minus 29 yards for the night, but his team won and went to the playoffs. This sounds a bit like the cross to me. God became a man, was pushed around by his enemies, and was executed as a criminal by the Roman governor of Palestine. Satan appeared to have won. Jesus of Nazareth was dead. His disciples were scattered. On the surface, it seemed that God had suffered defeat. Or had he? 3 days later, Jesus was alive from the dead. Over a period of 40 days, he showed himself alive to hundreds of people. Then, 51 days later, Peter explained that he had all been part of a divine strategy. He said in Acts chapter 2 and verse 23, "This man was handed over to you by God's set purpose and foreknowledge, and you, with the help of wicked men, put him to death by nailing him to the cross." He continued and cited Old Testament predictions which had been fulfilled by the resurrection. The final came when he announced, "God has made this Jesus, whom you crucified, both Lord and Christ." In Acts chapter 2 and verse 36. There you have it, a game plan that looked to the entire world like craziness. one which still mystifies disciples in our church huddles and observers in the World Stadium light. But the Son executed his Father's call to perfection. He died on the cross to take care of our sin problems and was raised from the dead. Through God's perfect plan, through God's perfect strategy, which looked foolish to the onlookers, we have become victorious. We have become winners. Unfortunately, though, there are many people today who still will not believe in the cross and in the resurrection of Jesus. They think it is absurd to believe in something that far-fetched. Then try to explain that the resurrection never occurred and that we are all fools for believing it. Well, ladies and gentlemen, call me a fool, because I believe with all my heart in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. For the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 18. This evening we are going to examine God's game plan by looking at the resurrection of Jesus Christ. First, without a doubt, Jesus was resurrected from the dead. As I told you earlier, many people do not believe in Jesus' resurrection. Here are several arguments people use to support their position. Some critics argue that the resurrection was actually a hoax by suggesting that Jesus did not actually die on the cross. This theory, which is known as the swoon theory, teaches that Jesus only appeared dead but was revived later in the tomb. I do not buy this theory, and I'll tell you why. Before Jesus was placed on the cross, the Bible tells us in Matthew chapter 27, verse 26, that he was flogged, which means he was whipped 39 times with leather thongs that contained jagged pieces of bone and lead. Dr. C. Truman Davis, a medical doctor who has meticulously studied crucifixion from a medical perspective, describes the effects of a flogging. The heavy whip is brought down with full force again and again across a person's shoulders, back, and legs. At first, the heavy thongs cut through the skin only. Then as the blows continue, they cut deeper into the tissues, producing first an oozing of blood from the veins of the skin, and finally spurting arterial bleeding from vessels in the underlying muscles. The small balls of lead first produce large, deep bruises, which are broken open by subsequent blows. Finally, the skin of the back is hanging in long ribbons, and the entire area is an unrecognizable mass of torn, bleeding tissues. When it is determined by the centurion in charge that the prisoner is near death, the beating is finally stopped. Before Jesus was even placed on the cross, he was half dead. After he was almost whipped to death in Matthew 27:35, explains that Jesus was then crucified on a cross. When Jesus was crucified, he was laid on 2 pieces